As in, I've rarely seen angry people do things that are useful, or seen much benefit in the emotion as a whole. Nor have I ever seen people who complain and make themselves a victim, find success in life. So my take on these things are: A, if you're angry, perhaps zoom out and consider what has caused you to act like a bitch. And B, if you're a victim, you should consider doing the same thing and figure out what is causing you to exhibit bitch-made behavior.
What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the DJ Radio Podcast. I'm your host, Thiago, and today I had a great conversation with Smokey the Bera, co-founder of Berachain. We covered everything about the ecosystem, Proof-of-liquidity's recent mainnet activation, and many more. And before we go into the episode, I just wanted to leave a disclaimer here that any tokens mentioned here can be owned by me or my guests, and nothing said in this episode is financial advice. All right, so let's hop into the episode. Hey Smokey, welcome to the show, man. How are you doing?
Hey man, good. Thanks for having me.
So at the start of every show, I usually ask like, what's your background? Like, how did you join crypto, and what motivated you to create Berachain?
Yeah, man. I'd say that I first started, exploring crypto in 2015, 2016. My background is actually, I'd say, pretty far on the opposite side of things, in that I very much started in sort of like biotech and pharmaceuticals and drug discovery, and built my first company in that space. But was living in the Bay Area at one point and seeing a lot of smart friends, working their way into crypto. And I think it's just one of those things where the space itself seemed interesting from a fundamentals point of view. And also, perhaps even more so than that, I think when you see enough smart friends moving in a certain direction, you sort of have to ask yourself a question of, is there something I'm missing here, right? So I figured that it would be best to sort of, dip my toes in a little bit, and see if there's something to get involved in. And a few years later, we have definitely gotten involved.
Oh, it's great, man. Yeah, it's like I think crypto is like a magnet, like for curious people. And so, before we go to Berachain, like, what are the main difference you see in like building like in biotech, Web 2 style, and like building in crypto? What are the biggest like reality shocks?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, man. I think that crypto is a lot less disciplined. It's also a lot less fundamentals driven. It's simultaneously more and less skeptical, in that for biotech, et cetera, you do fundamental research for 3, 4 years, and then you try to raise a seed round for, $15 million or something, right? Valuation. For crypto, you sort of like fuck around for a couple of weeks and then you do the same thing. Um, and I think that, there's a weird dichotomy there, in that, however, there's also some overlap, in that a lot of things in crypto are, coin flips, that have negative EV expectations. Same thing with a lot of stuff in biotech when it comes to drug development, et cetera. Both highly regulated spaces. Um, but yeah, I just think that the burden for proof of something being worth spending time or money on tends to be a lot higher in biotech. But there also tend to be a lot more real tangible outcomes. Um, Crypto, I think, is still in its much earlier stages as an industry as a whole, right? But probably some interesting mental models that overlap over there.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes, I don't think I ever like talked to somebody that used to like build or work in biotech. So it's interesting. And man, can you like give like a brief overview on Berachain for like the audience that don't know like the chain, how the chain works, and like the main differentiator is proof of liquidity? Can you give like a brief overview on how it works?
Yeah, man. So the high level is that, Berachain is an EVM identical layer one. So what that means is that you've got the exact same execution environment as ETH. So if you're building applications, if you're interacting with the chain, you've pretty much got the most compatible environment possible, complete with dev tooling and all the different things that one would need if they're building on Ethereum mainnet. We use something called Comet BFT for consensus under the hood. And Comet BFT is more commonly used within Cosmos chains, but it effectively means you've got single slot finality, so transactions reach finality very quickly as opposed to having to wait for many block confirmations. And that also affords some interesting performance increases, meaning that the chain is about 6-7 times faster than Ethereum with like sub 2-second block times. I'd say that's not the majority of the reason that people know Berachain. That's just sort of like the basic technical stack. I'd say moreover, people know Berachain for this concept of proof of liquidity, right? And what proof of liquidity really accomplishes versus classic proof of stake or delegated proof of stake is that the system or the chain itself in Berachain and all chains are a byproduct of blocks being produced, right, by this validator set that's securing the network. In the case of proof of stake, the vast majority of that value or that validator set is effectively the vast majority of that value being generated by the network and the validator set is going towards those validators and their stakers or people who are basically contributing solely network security. And that provides value. However, in many cases, it ends up being somewhat leaky, right? In that that's flowing outside the system. It's not necessarily actually doing anything to help that chain or that ecosystem grow. I think Berachain very much flips this model on its head and actually takes those block rewards or those incentives that are produced by the chain simply as a byproduct of its operation, and it directs them into the ecosystem. So in a typical chain or proof of stake chain, emissions basically flow from the chain through its validators to either simply just those validators alone, or if it's a delegated proof of stake model, the validators and their delegates, and sort of out of the ecosystem. In the case of Berachain, that inflation flows inwards. So you effectively have the validators, pushing emissions towards the applications, and those applications in turn distributing them towards the users. So it empowers the applications to act as almost like distribution funnels in a B2B2C sense to acquire new users and to actually build the ecosystem. So yeah, man, that's sort of like the high level. And what proof of liquidity does is sort of twofold. On one hand, it's basically meant to allow the liquidity and the capital living on the chain to play a role in its security and overall its economic incentives, and to really align those incentives between liquidity and security at the chain level. And secondly, it's to really allow the chain to drive value and incentives and I'd say adoption potential to the applications that are living on top of the chain. So it's sort of like the idea of like the operating system helping to power the applications and your Microsoft Word, so on and so forth, as opposed to these things being entirely standalone.
Yeah. So yeah, your explanation gave me a few questions. At first, on the EVM equivalent side, like when Ethereum gets its Spectra upgrade, I don't know if it will be included, but there is an EIP for like to every EOA in smart contract wallet, something like that. I'm not like very aware how it's working. Like, can you guys implement it like right after if it goes through?
Yeah, 100%. And that is one of the things that's on the roadmap, because the whole point of us being, not even because there's almost like 3 degrees, and it's kind of weird nuance / jargon. Is like there's EVM compatible, which is like you can deploy Solidity smart contracts. There's EVM equivalent, which is like that, but kind of some more. I don't think it's super well defined. It could also be my lack of knowledge. And then there's EVM identical, which is like I think what we've sort of more or less coined, because there isn't another chain, at least to the best of my knowledge, that has that one-to-one execution environment with ETH mainnet. They all have some degree of variance in terms of like opcodes or EIPs or whatever it might be. That's a little bit more nuanced, right?
So I'm not as knowledgeable in this area either. Yeah. So I thought like the equivalent and identical would be the same thing. Didn't know that.
No, that's all good. No worries at all. All I was saying is that basically it's as close as you can get to ETH mainnet as possible.
All right. So that's good, because like the transaction approval is like really annoying when like I was shit coining on Solana on the AI coins and went to Base, like the experience was just terrible. I'm used to like operating the EVM, but like the transaction approve to like do like fast stuff, it's like pretty annoying. So it's good that it's on the roadmap. And when you come to the incentives, like there's a conversation like right now on Solana about all this distraction happening, and I think it's like good time to have like these like validators aligned with the apps on the proof of liquidity. By the way, congrats on the launch yesterday.
Thank you.
when like you started like to model this, to think about it, like when you start to like building Berachain, how like did the idea to bring like proof of liquidity to life came?
I mean, look, it was very multifactorial. It wasn't just my thought process. There are a few different people in the mix there. Sammy from our team helped contribute a bunch. Papa helped contribute. They're 100%. Effectively a number of different forms of thinking there. But I think that the mechanism that we aligned on, or the version that we ended up with, was something that had elements or had features that were similar enough to other things that we've seen before, in that there's this concept of validators having gauges, right, or the ability to choose where their emissions go based on their delegations, right? Or this idea of an incentive marketplace that allows someone to say, hey, I'm willing to give you X amount of my token. In an exchange, you're going to give me 3X amount of these emissions that you're pushing out, right? That increase capital efficiency. It was, I think, a lot of taking concepts that existed and that people were somewhat familiar with already, and then working backwards to bring them into a real world, if you will, right? And into a new form, in the form of proof of liquidity. So, I mean, what were we looking for? We were looking for things that ultimately accomplish those goals that I mentioned, right? Of aligning liquidity with security, and of course, making sure that we found a way to actually support apps. And I think that's sort of how proof of liquidity is set up, right? The validators that have more BGT, or the bearer governance token, delegated towards them are the ones that produce larger block rewards. So effectively, the people who are securing the chain are also incentivized to have the most liquidity flowing towards them. And all those block rewards are flowing towards applications on the chain, which is very much sort of going towards that second point of helping those apps reach adoption. So I don't think it's a perfect system. I think we've definitely got more work to do. But nonetheless, we are, I think, very much directionally correct now.
I think one thing that proves like you guys are directionally correct is like after the idea of PoL, we saw like a whole new set of chains like building towards this. Like with all the conversation between like bigger apps are gonna like want to own the whole stack to like earn the MEV profits, and we've seen like Uniswap building its chain that it is a flop until now. We just saw Athena with the convergence announcement, and like GYTX moving to a new chain. And like this value alignment, do you believe like this will like stop a little bit all these like big apps migrating to its new chain? Or
No, not necessarily. As in, like, I think that in each case, or I think that the overall trend of an application becoming large, like there's almost a weird circle of life where an application lives on a chain, and then it's like, oh, we're too big for this chain. We should be our own chain and like internalize our own MEV, and or own our own order flow, whatever that might be, and burn our own gas token, etc. Which is honestly kind of a meme in most cases. Like very few gas tokens really accrue value, but like we can pretend that's okay. And then they get to the point where they have their own chain, and if they continue growing, they're like, fuck, we should become a general purpose chain. And then when they're a general purpose chain, they're like, oh fuck, like now we need specificity again, right? It's like I think you can very much get into this like eternal cycle. I think that, like, for example, in the cases that you mentioned, I think that Unichain is like not seeing the adoption that they were expecting so far. I think Athena is very interesting and very opinionated, and I'm friendly with the team, and I think Guy is one of the better founders, or one of the best founders, quite honestly, in the space. And I think that like they've actually they very correctly predicted the way the space was going, and gotten ahead of that curve, right? And where I think they've actually built an interesting counterexample is that a lot of people are saying that one of the reasons that Ethereum will retain value over time is that institutions need that degree of security, is in that degree of decentralization and network security, in order to be willing to secure their tens, hundreds of billions of dollars. But Athena has also showed that they're actually willing to take a punt on something that's quite different from that too. So like I don't think the trend will stop. I do think that proof of liquidity makes it more sustainable and more realistic for large breakout applications to stay on one chain. And what's even more interesting is that at times it can even pair with proof of liquidity, and the fact that Berachain is EVM identical to allow a chain like that to build in its own sovereign environment, or mostly sovereign environment, as an L2, or as effectively like an extension of Berachain, while taking advantage of PoL, but having their own clean execution layer, mempool, etc. So like there's a lot of ways to skin the cat, is the short way of putting it.
Oh, got it. Yeah, the chain more like an example, and
Yeah.
like chain. By the way, I don't think it makes sense because like a DEX is like, in my opinion, is a piece of infra for like generalist chain. But anyways, if let's say if I want to build an L2 on top of Berachain, I
Yeah.
can still like bribe the validators to get the BGT emissions too, in
Correct.
like the same state. Oh, I
Correct.
didn't.
There's and that's one of the things that people actually haven't gotten too deep on as of yet. But I think that can be really exciting.
Yeah. So on top of that, do you have like any idea of protocols that could do something like this and try to develop a layer two on top of Verachain to play like the proof of liquidity game in like in a better way than being like an app in the generous chain?
Yeah, I mean, like I think that what gets interesting here is like there's a way that layer twos can actually end up being value accretive as opposed to parasitic to Berachain. I think my belief is that in the long run, L2s are very are in the long run, L2s are good for Ethereum, right? They scale its distribution,
Great.
they allow more users to come on board. In the short term, I think they've murdered Ethereum's narrative in many ways because no one
Yeah.
cares about data availability or blob space for the most part as of yet, right? It's just not mature enough as of yet, right? Fees have gone down a whole bunch. Many of these L2s are making what 300 or something, dollar, like are basically making a ton of sequencer fees for every dollar that they pay the L1. So in the short run, they're reducing chances of success. In the long run, they're increasing it. In the case of Berachain, what you could actually do is you could have, a LP token that is composed of, effectively Bera, like the gas token of Berachain, and for example, the stake, like governance token of an L2, right? Let's say it's like Freak or something like that, right? And you could have a Bera Freak LP that becomes something that actually is voted in for proof of liquidity and ends up receiving emissions or as a reward vault. You could have an L2 that's secured by that, reward token or that LP token, for example, right? Earning BGT and contributing to liquidity and block rewards and security on the L1, while at the same time taking that BGT earned and using it to incentivize the bridge contract, for example, right? So I think there's a lot of different ways that one could effectively use PoL to give an L2 native yield or to basically pass back value to an L2 that would not be easy to do within an L1 environment.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it would make sense like for perp decks or some the game consumer sphere, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that it's interesting for perp taxes. I think it's interesting for the consumer side. I think it's interesting for RWA chains. I think it's even potentially interesting for like gaming applications. Really, anything that has either a ton of user volume or a ton of like pure liquidity volume.
You got it. Like we don't need to get in too much into the technical stuff, but in the future, can an L2 have like the needed latency to like build a game or like some application that has a lot of like microtransactions?
Mm-hmm. I mean, on Berachain
Would
itself
possible
or as an L2.
as an L2?
Yeah, I mean, like there's actually a couple different groups doing that at the moment, right? So we do think that like the fact is you can build an Arb Orbit L2, and that's probably the easiest stack to work with. You can build an OP stack L2, but our block times are so much lower than Ethereum, because I think in some cases they can be a little bit less stable. Because it's like if you have a 2-second roll up, but your chain is also 2 seconds, then it gets tougher to bundle that. But yeah, like there's people who are developing, effectively L2s for exactly that use case on Berachain. And in fact, there's already like one live, I believe, that it's called Kuma. It used to be IDEX, which is one of like the first dexes on Ethereum. And they've built like a pretty cool perps dex that's using Berachain. And when I chatted with the founder, I think last week, he said they've seen more organic adoption / volume since they moved to Berachain than they had previously. So I think that's just like a cool example of like, soon putting proof of liquidity to good use. And B, just like building an interesting L2 product to Bera.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that about this like L2s in development already. Man,
Mhm.
let's take like a few steps back. And
Yeah.
I want to know why haven't like POL launched alongside Mainnet? Was it like by design or you guys were finishing like trying some stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it was 80-20 by design, in that either way, POL needed to be turned on in a manner that allowed the chain to form like a safe base of capital to start. By that, what I really mean is that like BGT, which is the governance slash emissions token of Berachain, is earned via providing liquidity on the network, right? So when
Yeah.
Berachain turned on, those POL emissions were only really pointing at one location, the DEX, and that was by design. We wanted there to be a safe, well vetted, like accessible point that could be used there, so that people didn't end up in a situation where they were aping into random pools or sort of like aping into random like uni forks or Aave forks or whatever it might be, where they were very unsure of their security. We also wanted to make sure that the BGT supply was sufficiently decentralized such that once POL truly turned on, you didn't get like a single actor that could just control the network, right? And this is even more important when it comes to on-chain governance, which we'll sort of move into the next month or so. So I think that the answer is we probably could have turned on POL, like full POL, that allows those BGT emissions to go to other applications on the chain sooner, but we did want to make sure it was more technically robust. We wanted to work through any of the kinks and make sure that that distribution is really clean. And we experimented with different models that had sort of different degrees of freedom and had almost different amounts of responsibility put on validators versus bots, etc. And I think that we went with the one that seemed like it had the lowest chance of causing additional friction for people, and probably the highest lift on the core team. So yeah, man, I think it was partially safety and partially attention to detail.
All right. So great. Do you like have any regret on this choice?
No, none as of yet. I mean, I think, like I said, I would have loved to do a little bit faster, but I also wanted to make sure that it rolled out smoothly. And so far, I do think that's been the case. Hasn't been like perfect, as in like there's little things where I want to make sure there's better things on the front end, or like better displaying of metadata or information about which vaults are available at what times, et cetera, et cetera. But like for the most part, from most of the reception we've gotten, it's definitely airing well. I think that the only thing that I still would like to work on is just making sure that some of the developer experience side for applications looking to put up incentives and stuff can be improved. Because right now, primarily just from a security vector point of view, there's some things that are like reduced in their functionality. For example, like if an application posts an incentive, right now they can't withdraw that, right? So I want to make sure that stuff like that can be improved from like just an elegance and like a dev experience point of view over time.
Oh, cool. And like when you said about the governance, you said it will go live like fully the next month, right?
Mhm.
And how did you like the voting for the first batch of like new incentives roll out? Was it the validators, Drex? How did it work?
Yeah, so there's a group of there's what it's called probably I think the best way of positioning or what we call it is like the Guardian Council, which is a group of primarily non-Berachain affiliated or non-core team members, who have basically either been technical auditors, legal auditors, major community members, effectively folks who've had stake or exposure to the Berachain ecosystem for quite some time, but are not overly biased in one way or the other by the team slash the ecosystem, that have helped to basically vet and agree to the initial set of vaults that have gone live. And in most cases, they're looking for a bunch of information is disclosed, both through a forum to those guardians, and on the forums where like everyone where all the different teams that have received approvals for those vaults have basically publicly said, hey, here's our protocol, here's the different links where you can see the token, here's where our treasury is, etc. Here's the incentives that we're going to put up. Here's how this is like value additive to the Berachain ecosystem, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that is something that has been, quite well received by folks, because I think it's made it obvious that it wasn't, there haven't been any weird insider cabal games. It's actually just been, okay, if people show they're driving value to Bera, if they show they're building something that's helpful for the ecosystem, and if they show that there is the right degree of safety and there's audits, et cetera, then, they should be able to engage in PoL. So that's sort of how the first couple of batches will be done, and then not long after they'll be able to go full speed and sort of just have fully on-chain governance take over.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I went to like most of the proposals on the forums. Like, I read a bunch of things
Yeah.
to see where the incentives were going.
Yep.
And like, how often will this like new vaults roll out? Is it going to be weekly, like
Yeah, a
monthly,
weekly basis. Yeah, they
weekly
covered it in
basis?
the most recent blog where the foundation team talked more about the initial rollout. I think it's going to be weekly on Thursdays is the deadline, and I think new vaults will be announced on Monday. I can't remember for sure, but I think so.
That's good. I haven't seen this yet. All right, cool. And when you started, you guys designed Boico. I think you were like the first protocol that they used like this the Roico protocol doing the
Hmm.
Boico. Like, why did you do it, and like why with these like time locks like 30 days and then like 90 days locks for
Hmm.
the depositors?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the whole point of Royco slash Boyco, which is a sort of a product or a variant of Boyco that Jack from our team and myself, but primarily Jack helped design, was very like we've seen chains do these pre-launch campaigns, and we've seen them largely be huge scams, where it's like, okay, I'm going to put all this TVL into a bridge, or I'm going to put all this money into this. I'm going to put all this money into these apps in an ecosystem prior to TGE so that the price goes up. And we're just like, well, that's just, kind of fucked. We should probably do something that actually helps applications here. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the whole focus of Berachain, right? It's an accelerant for the application layer. So Boyco is moreover meant to take a lot of these almost like under the table liquidity deals that tend to exist between protocols and large LPs, like, sort of like your some large Asian family offices, et cetera, and give them an even playing field for that. So anyone could go in there and say, okay, cool, like this market is allowing me to gain exposure to this protocol, and these 2 or 3 levels of yield stacking, let's say, many of them in the form of points initially, but a lot of those guys issuing tokens that turn into something quite real. And then having some Bera incentives on top, and using that to sort of help solve the cold start problem in the ecosystem. And that way, that means that the chain came live with billions of dollars of capital already brought in, a top 10 chain, and at some points top 5, top 6, top 7 chain by TVL. And it gave, I think, a lot of these applications a platform to continue growing, whether that be Dolomite, where you could get some of the best rates on looping ETH across all DeFi, or Infrared, which has quickly become like a top 3, top 5 liquid staking protocol, or Kodiak, which has quickly become a top DEX. Like all these sorts of things have allowed, I think, the ecosystem to get a bunch of traction.
All right, got it. But like, so was the lockup period because like it is the time for the ecosystem to mature and like it grows like organically, or was
Correct.
it another reason? Mm.
Well,
And
yeah, it's really that, and it's also just like, hey, there's some amount of time that it took to get from A to B, if that makes sense, right? As in, you don't want that lock to be so short that people have no skin in the game, but you don't want that lock to be so long that what's the right word? You don't want that lock to be so long that that people are just like,
it
what
is
the fuck? Like, I'm not going
incentivized
to get any
people.
yield.
Yeah, yeah, I think like Blast suffered with this in the first time. That was like you don't know when you're gonna get your money back, and I think until they like at a date, people weren't depositing like too much capital because
Yep.
of it. And so in the Boyko capital, it cannot like farm BGT right now, right?
Correct. Yep. Because in order to actually farm BGT, that LP needs to be staked effectively, and you can't do that from Boyco. And also, they're already being incentivized with Bera. Therefore, via Boyco, they're already getting exposure. Then that liquidity needs to go somewhere else to earn BGT.
Okay, got it. And man, like, so when this like this period ends, I think it's like 6th of May, right?
Hmm.
And like, how do you think the POL incentives would be enough to keep this capital on the chain? And if not, like, do you guys like are you guys planning something to help keeping this money inside the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best answer there is that Yes and no. In that, on one hand, I think that there'll be a bunch of capital that was just mercenary as fuck, that was trying to farm Bera incentives, and they'll leave. I think a lot of, like, for example, the idle Bitcoin LST capital might do that. I do think that there are other, pools of capital, especially those around like major liquidity, or around certain stables, or around more, I'd say, productive assets that will probably roll over into new vaults or into new products on the chain. And what we're working to help set up is effectively just like clean, easy front ends that allow people to roll their capital from Boyko Vault A, to new Protocol B, and I think that will be quite powerful.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I think it's gonna be interesting to see it plays out. And man, so this is like a kind of like a wrap of the first like phase of like Berachain. And from like the beginning, like beginning of February to now, how do you evaluate the launch in general? Everything like Boyko, PoL, like mainnet, all the coordination with apps. Like, how do you evaluate this as a whole?
I think that's a tricky / open-ended question, man. What do you mean by how do you evaluate it?
Yeah, like what did you like the most? What did you like didn't like? What you could you done different? And these
Oh,
kinds of stuff.
I mean, look, I think that it's a good question, man. I think that a lot of times what we could probably do better is just like internal coordination, and then as a result of that, external comms. For example, I still have people who ask me like all the time, like, when do the Boyko markets unlock? And we're just like, dude, what the fuck? Like, all the documentation's at 30-day, 90-day. Like, I understand people don't read, but there's only so many opportunities that we can give people to not read.
Sure.
So, stuff like that comes to mind. Yeah, I mean, I think that I would have loved for us to have sort of like more cohesive pushes on different efforts when it comes to education in terms of what is PoL, et cetera. But I also think the tricky part is like, working within certain restrictions there as well in terms of what it takes to be able to describe things cleanly from a legal point of view. So I think like the things that we could have done better would have been coordination, communication, and probably even like, more and more building in public to some extent. But every solution comes with a trade-off, in my opinion. So I'm not unhappy about how things have gone. I just wish we had been a little bit faster and a little bit more organized. I think overall, though, I don't think people have been angry with the way things have rolled out. I think people have actually been like relatively pleasantly surprised from what I can see, with, sort of the uptake.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, the question I think like how would you like would be a better one. Like forgive my like non-native English.
Yeah.
And about this, like yeah, I saw like people like me and like some friends, a lot of people that used to that go here playing the early GFI games, like really like we're really excited about like the chain.
Hmm.
And I from the Brazilian and from like the global like CT community, let's say like that, I heard like some similar critics that like didn't make sense. And I want to come to this educational part that you said, like Berachain, PoL, everything's like very complex.
Yeah.
And I've been very like deep into the ecosystem like since like the second week of mainnet, and
Yeah.
I still sometimes don't find stuff. I'm learning new things like every day,
Yeah.
and people don't read, like you said.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I talked to some founders like from like new different protocols, and a lot of them like talked about education. Like we our biggest challenge is educating our users so they understand. So Berachain got a lot of like unfair hit. Like and a lot of I heard people saying like it is just a new VC chain and like low float, a high FDV, and
Mhm.
no differentiation. They didn't even know like what POL was about.
Yeah.
So how do you guys have any initiative like on like education like the general like audience, let's say like that, so people can start like seeing Berachain as it is
Yeah, for
instead
sure,
like
man. I also think that's like a lot of it's time and place, right? In that, especially in super shitty market conditions, people don't want to think about, what is this new chain? They just want to think, am I going to make a stupid amount of money or not? And, unfortunate, but that is also some part of the reality. And the other part is that for a little while we were talking about POL, but we couldn't exactly point to it fully, which means that now is probably the time where I think we can start being more active and more aggressive with that, rollout. And I think we've also gotten a little bit more comfort and a little bit more clarity from a legal point of view on what can or can't be said, right? Because there are some words that can be used to describe the different value accrual mechanisms of Berachain that could be, very easy for someone to grok from a traditional perspective, but I don't think we'd necessarily want to describe it in that way from a legal perspective, right? So trying to think about the right ways of positioning that are responsible from in the long-termist point of view, right? So yeah, man, I think that's like part of it, and I think the next little while would be a lot of just beating that drum, right? For example, I think one of the things that I found has really helped people's understanding, at least if they have a high level understanding of what a blockchain is understand that PoL is taking that inflation that typically goes out of the system and pointing it into the system is like, oh, okay, like, yeah, now I kind of understand where the yield is coming from, right? It's instead of having that, 10% staking yield, you're having like 1 or 2% staking yield and the vast majority towards liquidity yield, right? So I think that people are like starting to see the way that the system actually works. And I think that as we see more and more examples live in progress, we'll be able to make more and more case studies that allow people to say, okay, PoL is just like a machine that allows me to incentivize action X with token Y, and that those incentives are being powered by the chain itself.
Yeah. I think it's gonna take a while, but people will understand. And I remember just like hearing a few people saying, "Yeah, it's gonna be just like TIA, like very inflationary, like 20% rewards." I was like, "No, guys, that's not how it works."
It was insane, right? Because it's also tricky because as for the first couple of days, I think the hyperliquid mafia was like, "Oh, Berachain's a VC coin," like, and I'm like, okay, cool, man. Like, yes, we do have VCs. I'm sorry, but I also do think that we had an airdrop that was very focused on the community, and that contrary to the vast majority of recent drops, was not, my biased opinion, a scam. Like, there's people out there that are advertising that they have very high amounts of circulating supply that have sub-single digit or single-digit amounts of circulating supply at the moment. I think I can very, very confidently say that we are quite far from that position. And then, this narrative that Berachain has like TIA-style staking, which couldn't be farther from the truth, became a thing for a day or two. Really, the staking rate's like 2%. Like, it's like lower than ETH, which is like, pretty fair if you ask me. And that's just because as a network that's securing, $3 billion plus, you do need to have some base rate yield for those validators as well, right? We couldn't secure the network with BGT as much as we'd love to, because BGT didn't exist when the chain went live. It had to be secured with Bera, and a lot of that came from, investors, team members, the foundation, etc.
Sure. And all right. And going to the VC side, you guys, I think you guys had like 36% of the supply to the VCs was a big number. And I know like you raised it like from like you sold like 20% at right in the beginning before the chain, right? So do you think like these like I missed the I I forgot the word here, but like do you think this like got in like that it will make some was a problem at some time like having like this much percentage sold to VCs, and do you think it got in your way in some time in some form?
I don't think that it's ever functionally gotten in our way beyond like sort of FUD that can come downstream of that. And I understand that. Like, and I'm not, going to attempt to die on any sorts of those hills. I think that a couple things that we did along the way, as in like prior to launch, as we raised more capital, we basically took aggressive steps to buy back and or buy out some of our initial VCs where there were some of the most dilutive. And a number of our, sort of Series B investors actually went and bought out those seed investors as well and sort of helped clean up that cap table a little bit. So the end dilution ended up being like 34 or 35, like 33, 34%, which is again, like, not great. It's not a number that I think always inspires confidence, to be very clear. But it's a group of people that have, for the most part, bet on us and help us get to where we are right now. And some of them are still very strong advocates who I think are working alongside the team on a regular basis, right? So I think there's two ways that one can see VCs. One is you can see them as a net positive that helps put you in touch with portcos and other opportunities and later stage capital providers and strategics and groups who can drive a lot of value to the chain. The other you can see is people who are going to wait until unlocks then dump on your head. Both are true in different senses. And some VCs look more like one of those things than the other. So, and ultimately, it's our choice whether to raise venture capital or not, right? And it's a choice that we took. I think that my biggest change I would have made if I had greater foresight would have probably just been to raise less in the seed round. But I also just don't think that we had a good sense of how much it would take to build what we're trying to build. I don't think that we had the greatest degree of like foresight in terms of the technical undertaking. I think that over time the team has evolved, the degree of maturity and the degree of understanding of what the technical lift looks like has evolved. And I think we're in a much better position to be able to say, okay, cool, we have this many resources. Here's how we can put them to the best use.
I got it. Yeah, I think about the VCs, I pretty much agree with you. I was never in the camp that like VC is bad and like extractive. I think this was like a narrative from like the French influencers to dump their meme coins on newer participants.
Yep.
And all right.
I mean, it's always
continue.
fun to hate on people in crypto, right? Like it's kind of like the baseline.
Yeah, people
Oh,
just
sorry, I think I was just lagging a little bit, man. My bad. I was just saying, like, people in crypto love to do nothing more than bitch. Like that's like their favorite pastime. So
yeah, it's true. Stay on Twitter the whole day, like cussing strangers on the internet.
yeah,
And
exactly.
regarding the VCs and like the staking, another like thing that you guys got hit was like about like the staking rewards being unlocked, and like did you could you change that, or like would you couldn't, like would you do like it different if you're about like to raise now for this?
Yeah. I mean, two things, right? One is that it definitely would have been non-trivially difficult from a technical implementation point of view, because you'd effectively have like two classes of the Bera token, right? One of which that could be staked, and one of which that couldn't be staked, which I think could be quite weird from an accounting / a tech perspective. The other potential alternative, and maybe this would have worked, is just all those would have gone to custody with different VCs and they wouldn't have been able to do anything with them. But I could just see that turning into pretty problematic operational errors at some point. So like, I think a couple things, right? One, the staking rate is like pretty tiny. And from what we've seen, the vast majority of people earning those rewards are either, basically use them to delegate back to themselves, or just kind of holding them. But two is that, at the time that we first raised, it was very much the meta that layer one tokens and insider tokens were stakeable. And rewards were unlocked if you take a look at the Swees and Aptoses and et cetera of the world,
I
right?
remember that. Yeah.
So like, I think our biggest sin, and it's one that I would rather own than like, walk away from, was like, we took too damn long to ship. We shipped, and I think that like I'm pretty proud of what we shipped at the end of the day. But we made a lot of mistakes along that path. And I think that, we find ourselves in a situation with, I think, a better team and, better direction to actually make sure that we don't fall down that same rabbit hole in the future. And that's just a matter of like shots on net and getting more reps in, right? So that's kind of my take on it, man. I do think that like, I understand the FUD, I just don't think it was productive.
Yeah, like although I disagree, I don't think like the FUD is productive. Also, like what happened happened, and like we should move on, right?
Yeah, I mean, like it's also just like, at this point, do I see VCs or people with staking just like turbo nuking the chart every day? No, I, for the most part, see people being like pretty responsible actors within the ecosystem. I think it's just like, it's very different from, I think the like theatricized initial point of view.
Yeah, I agree. Man, now going away from the VCs and coming to something that you said at the beginning of the episode, when the idea of proof of liquidity came to like use like more, have more productive TVL, right? And in nowadays, like the concepts of REV, like real economic value, for people listening that don't know, it's like getting more traction, like pushed for the Blockworks guys. And right now, at the current form, I know like that's one day only of proof liquidity, but most of the TVL is like it's parked farming some pool, it will migrate, but like it doesn't it in my view it doesn't like incentivize like new activities on chain besides provide liquidity either for
Mhm.
like perps or
Mhm.
like dexes lending markets anything of this. So last time I checked, like Berachain was like 6 and tvl and like 14th index volume on the week. So do you think like can become a problem in the future if like REV becomes like the standard for valuing an L1 and having all these incentives to park capital and do nothing could
Mm,
like become a problem for you for a bear
not
chain?
really. For a different reason. Largely because, right now, as mentioned, proof of liquidity is sort of in many cases used towards liquidity, right? It can be passive, it can be active, but it's incentivizing TVL. However, the more interesting side is that, and we've thought about this quite a bit, is that proof of liquidity can actually be used to incentivize really any on-chain action. It doesn't just have to be liquidity provision, but if you look at the actual mechanism of proof of liquidity, it's that a token is staked, and there's sort of a vault, and BGT emissions are pointed towards that vault. However, that token does not need to be downstream of liquidity. That token could exist for any different reason. So, for example, one use case that we're seeing people pop up with, and you might have seen on the forums, that's kind of interesting, is perps volume, right? That's not even like providing liquidity on perps, but it's actually saying that people who have done X amount of volume, or perhaps generated Y amount of fees, will get this token. Right now, there's a way that that could be farmed like DYDX emissions back in the day, potentially, if that design space is not thoughtful enough. But there's also a way that that can be used to spur real economic activity. On the other hand, that can be used in ways to quickly scale deposits for RWAs. We think that part is really interesting. There's ways that that could be used to effectively incentivize content generation. There's ways that could even be used to build an interesting launchpad type product, right? Um, so I think the fact is, like, most L1s still aren't valued on real economic like REV per se, or real yield. I think there's still a lot valued on some combination of like the moneyness of their token, the strength or the reach of the ecosystem, brand name alignment, yada yada yada. Like the framework is highly unclear. But
Yeah.
what I do think is very real is that proof of liquidity is actually incredibly malleable when it comes to this, because as long as there's a token that can be staked, there's a way to drive value from it. And I think that there's also opportunities that we've seen with a number of different like teams, especially sort of in that RWA adjacent space, to use sources of off-chain yield, whether that be T-bills, et cetera, to almost build a baseline bribe rate that we think can get pretty interesting. So TLDR is like, I think that liquidity often starts as the base plate of a number of these different things, but the extensions of it can get way spicier and way more interesting.
No, I haven't like thought about this in this way. I was like thinking about like the incentives of DEX and
Mhm.
volume. I was like, it's gonna incentive like wash trading, so it doesn't make sense. I haven't like give it time to think through deep into it, but it's good, interesting to hear. And you mentioned RWAs, and I think I saw like a bunch of tweets from you in the last like couple of weeks, saying that like Berachain is like an ideal chain for RWAs, and
Mhm.
like what why so, and like how could like RWAs projects could like enjoy like this the best part of POL, even like for like non-crypto native institutions. And just let me formulate again. So for RWAs, like let's say we're working like something like Securitize, BlackRock, and all these TradFi companies that they're not like crypto native. So they probably wouldn't like play the bribe incentive games.
Mhm.
And like how do you think like these RWA projects could like enjoy the best part of like proof of liquidity of Berachain, but even if they don't like participate in the governance and all this kind of stuff?
I think that the best answer is probably a little bit closer to something like the Athena securitized type relationships, or like even Vita and different vault providers slash EtherFi type players. In that it doesn't need to be BlackRock itself figuring out how to use PoL incentives, right? But I very much do think that there are different service providers that can build around these products that can make them a little bit more sustainable over time. It probably works best when you are both the issuer and the manager, right? In terms of being able to control those different operational efficiencies. But as I really see it, the value is almost that, you have these tokens, you have this asset that's earning 5% off chain. You find a way to bring that on chain. Maybe that, as a vault manager, you have some performance fee based on your management of that. You can recycle part of that performance fee into, incentives and use that to find a way to effectively drive more demand for your product. And there's ways that it's not about that being circular. It's not saying, oh, like I can get 5% and now I'm going to use all that 5% to get 25. Like that doesn't really quite work. But what I do think is fair is that, one can figure out what performance fees look like for taking some of these products and bring them on chain as different forms of structured products. And then using that to incentivize demand for said structured product, provided that there's enough opportunity or enough, demand side off chain, right in the real world. And I think the broader thing that I'm getting at is that I'm not trying to say, oh, Berachain should be an RWA chain or like that's our thesis point. I think I'm moreover saying that in a world where the base rate of sort of like DeFi native capital is becoming a lot closer to the base rate of off-chain like real world capital. And it's no longer just DAI, and even DAI is becoming a lot closer to that, et cetera, right? That we should find ways to actually have that be more sustainable and use that to drive mechanisms like PoL within the ecosystem. And that PoL is meant to allow the chain's emissions to give applications the means of bootstrapping their own use. I could see that working quite feasibly for RWAs.
Got it. And is there like any like big project that you are excited RWA project that is deploying on Berachain right now? Or you?
Yeah, I mean, I probably can't disclose as of yet, but there's a couple that I'm quite excited about that I think are in each case, multi-billion-dollar opportunities that can, basically see their tokens on Berachain and that can gain a ton of traction here.
Oh, that's some alpha there. Interesting. And all right, so changing a little bit like a subject here, and something that I always like thought about, and when like PoL is running at full speed, it is supposed to like create a flywheel, right? So traders buy Bera, they deposit on LPs, collect BGT, redirect emissions, rinse, repeat, and like there's going to be probably a supply shrink in Bera. And while the token price is going up, the flywheel works great and it's like helps keep going up. But this reflexivity, it can create some bad outcome in the downside. And it's like, so am I missing something here, or like do you guys think about it, and like how could like this be mitigated?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that there's a few different ways to approach this, and one of the ways that we think about a bunch is almost like what this soft bottom per se looks like. Because yes, 100% PoL is like, it has elements of reflexivity, but I think that there's a couple things. One is that like value is being driven the entire time, which is to say, even as Bera is decreasing in value, let's say, right, and people are unstaking, selling off their Bera, etc. That means that the value of those incentives that are coming in, as in the amount of incentives flowing to BGT, is actually going up, right? As in per unit of BGT. That pretty much increases the amount of yields going towards BGT. And what's the easiest way to get BGT? It's by having more Bera, right? So you actually end up with a little bit of a self-reinforcing loop there. The way in which that reduces is if Bera falls by 50%, and then all the incentives also fall by 80% or something like that, right? Which is why one of the things that we care about a lot is also having lots of sources of exogenous incentives that are from not just Bera correlated assets, but stuff like ETH, stuff like stables, etc., Bitcoin, whatever it might be, that ends up being somewhat anti-fragile in those cases, right? So a lot of it comes down to allowing the yields going towards BGT to help balance out the fact that at times demand for Bera will have to fall off, right? And then allowing that to restart the cycle. So I think we will see periods of economic expansion and contraction.
Yeah. I understood. And my concern was like more if we have like a big bubble, big expansion, and we can have like a huge contraction too, and like these do like can do you think it can hurt the ecosystem like short, medium
Yeah.
term?
Yeah, no, it totally can, but I don't think it does so more than really any other L1 token, if that makes sense. Expanding and contracting, and a lot of its ecosystem being paired against it in the same way that, if Sol runs up, everything else on Sol goes up too, right? But if
Yeah.
AVAX or Sol craters, then same shit happens. Maybe it's a little bit more pronounced here, but I think that in this case, the Bear ecosystem actually brings in, on average, net more assets into the ecosystem than most of these other groups, as in like more external tokens from other chains that actually help to provide a little bit of that soft landing, as mentioned.
I got it. That's interesting, and it's gonna be interesting to see it play out. Like after we get like the first like big run up, gonna be interested to see this. And man, changing subject again. When
Yeah.
you said about like no infrared, sorry, the governance and like the BGT being like sufficiently decentralized. Infrared like IBGT was a little bit over 50% of all the BGT emission.
Yeah.
And do you think this can be a problem like for like infrared to get this much power like early on
Mm.
and can like prejudice the chain in some way in the future if like they
I
go
mean,
rogue or something like that?
objectively, yes. In that I do think that I think that it's a risk, but I also think that we know the team there quite well. The foundation has a stake in them through the Build a Bear program, and eventually that entire direction will be controlled by the token holders. So my take is that someone was going to build this product, right? Someone was going to build an LST for BGT, and in the same way that Lido/Coinbase control like 50+% of staked ETH, right? Or maybe it's a little bit less now, but I'm pretty sure it's still in that neighborhood.
Lido plus Coinbase.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's in the 40s.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like in the same way that that's the case, like as I see it, the infrared guys saw an opportunity early. They built around the system as close as they could. Um, and they outperformed, right? But what I do think will happen is we'll hopefully see more and more people building, effectively like just good competition to that. In terms of like LSTs for BGT, et cetera, that accrue yield in different ways or that are more opinionated or maybe have like different flywheels built around them. And then we'll probably see that decentralized as like people always chase good yield.
Yeah.
And I do think that a couple of strong players in that game could also be healthy over time in terms of every Lido finds its rocket pool, et cetera.
Yes.
So do I think that like it's a threat? Practically, no, but like in technicality, sure, I can see the downsides of it. I just don't think that it's necessarily avoidable in a system like this.
Mm. No, yeah, I got it. It's similar to the problem of Lido, and like they are just better. So
Yeah,
people,
like people want the best yields, they'll go with what gives them the best yields, right? And often if that's a better product, then so be it as well, you know?
yeah, and it's not just the you, in my opinion, like these like LSTs and LRTs, like they need liquidity and like they need like integrations in DeFi. So if you don't have it, it doesn't matter. So I
Yeah,
think that's why like Lido just moved so much ahead of competition on Ethereum land. And all
yeah,
right.
100%.
Um, all right, I got it. This was something that I was in my mind. I really like, enjoyed like the infrared product too.
Yeah.
Been farming there like since day one. All right, man. I don't, one like last question about the ecosystem and Berachain is like now is the DeFi chain,
Hmm.
and when you guys were building on the testnet, a lot of people were saying about like consumer apps
Yeah.
and what are like the projects slash sectors that you are like most interested to see live on Berachain right now?
Yeah. I think that a couple things, man. I think the consumer needs to come after there's a good liquidity base plate, right? And that you sort of need to start somewhere and then build up to something that can support lots of consumer volume. I also think that most consumer stuff happens in a slightly more risk-on market. Like either it's entirely decorrelated from the stuff that's happening in like in the on-chain world or financial world in any world, or it needs to be a risk on / a bullish enough market for these things to really explode and take space, if you will, right? So I think my take there is basically, I think that we'll see a bunch of cool consumer coming to Berachain soon. I think that the categories that I'm probably personally most excited about are, I think depins are very interesting. I think that their tokenomics are always tough to nail, but I think that they're great from a distribution point of view. I think that they do really well in Asian communities as well. And I think that the psychological aspect of having something like physically tangible is actually very big and underrated in my perception. And I think that beyond that, I'm probably pretty excited about some of the stuff that can come at the social layer. I think there's some interesting stuff happening with ZKTLS. I would just say that it's like, I don't have a very strong thesis on what wins in consumer, apart from stuff that leans into, sort of current trends, mobile experiences, a potential for virality. Honestly, weird shit is kind of the direction I think has the greatest degree of promise. Shock value is almost like what wins the most.
Yeah, it's an interesting point of view. Yeah, I think it's gonna be like some weird shit for now, because if you say like Instagram when it came out, it was weird shit. Like, why would I keep just post a picture of and just social network of pictures? So it
Yeah.
didn't make sense, a lot of sense before it started, and I think like every like new trend starts like that, right?
Yeah.
And all
You
right,
got that.
man. So sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
Oh, man, and like to wrap it up here, and like the a few questions, like how do you see like the industry evolving in the next few years, like the especially the like the layer one landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think the layer ones and chains as a whole will have to become more opinionated. I think that we will see more chains tending towards sort of the stuff that I mentioned in terms of driving value towards its applications, and I think that we'll see more people realizing that like a chain's value is in its application layer, right? Like maybe there's exceptions in the case of payments or like sort of massive amounts of RWAs, etc. But I do still think that many of those will end up routing through apps in some manner, whether it be their tokenization, their trading, whatever that might be, right? So I think we'll see that a lot. I do believe that we'll probably continue to see more VMs. And I think that it's unlikely that the EVM is displaced unless we see a massive player to the tune that they, Google, Apple, Facebook type, come in with their own, distribution force. Because I think that is the EVM's advantage right now. It has distribution, it has staying power, it has liquidity, it has an active dev community. It's still small in the grand scheme of things in terms of many other dev communities in existence. But like, it is by far the most Lindy at the moment, right? So I think that we'll continue to see EVM dominance, but I will not be surprised if at some point in the future we see a large incumbent that already has its own massive network and dev firepower pour it over it and make quite a statement. And I think that we'll probably see more L1s that end up being, just very single use case specific. Like I do think that app chains will make sort of a comeback, but I think that they'll be more thoughtful, value capture focused and perhaps cash flow positive or revenue positive app chains, which I think has been, a point of view that has been missing for L1s for a very long time. And I hope that we can be one of the ones to help, give that some light of day in terms of, how can an L1 capture value as opposed to simply just emitting it?
Yeah, so, yeah. I hope you guys can do it. And yeah, interesting. Like the view of the applications. I believe that the front ends like will become like a Web 2.0, where like the front ends like the Fed app thesis will play out and the Fed protocol thesis will die down, like slowly going into the future.
Yeah.
It's I believe, yeah. And man, what's the end game for Berachain? Do
Yeah, man. I mean, like, I think, look, we kind of want to be up there beside, I think that Bitcoin and Ethereum are perhaps in classes of their own and Solana right after. But I think that there's no reason that Berachain can't be right up there with the rest of them, right? I think we want to be the go-to place where people go to build an interesting new application. I think we want to be the place where applications go from 0 to 1. So, I think that that's really what it boils down to. How do we become the place where someone goes to build something cool, new, and interesting? Right now, I argue that's kind of like Solana and Base, depending on the crowd you're looking to cater to. And our goal is, I think, to build out our distribution funnel, the novelty of applications, and the overall value capture for apps to allow us to effectively check those boxes and find ourselves in that same competition.
Yeah, got it. Great, man. And all right, there's 2 questions before I wrap that I ask every guest here.
Yeah.
And the first one is like, how would you describe Berachain in 1 sentence?
Retarded excellence.
I wasn't expecting that. That's a good one. Why so?
Oh, why? I mean, like, it's pretty retarded. Like, it's, there's a bunch of anonymous bears built a multi-billion-dollar blockchain based on driving value to the application layer and aligning liquidity and security. I feel like it's not the playbook, or I feel like it sort of breaks some traditional mental models, which is good.
Yeah. And do you think this can be a problem like in the future, like for like outside players to take you guys seriously? Because
Probably.
the tech is real, is like innovative, but do you think like this can hurt like Berachain in some way?
Both ways. I think it definitely go both ways. And then, like,
Oh, man, your mic just like went far away.
sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I think it can go both ways. And that on one hand, if you think about the top 10 cryptocurrencies that people know, I would take a bet that things that look more like a joke in terms of like Doge and Sheep are in that mix, right? I think the more people know about those things than they know about Sui or Aptos for that matter, right? In terms of like the layperson. But at the same time, I think more people might be quick to break something off because it looks kind of weird. So in my opinion, it really goes both ways, man. I think that it can be a barrier to adoption in some cases, but I also think that it's something that can cause the people who take a bet on that early to have an outsized advantage.
That's true. Okay. And the other question is, it's an alpha. It's not a question. Like I asked for an alpha to the audience. It doesn't need to be like about like token. Could be about anything. About like a new app Berachain, about building a protocol, about anything, about life, whatever like you want to throw.
I mean, oh yeah. So it was just like sort of something I want to throw out there.
Yeah, it's an alpha for the audience. Anything that you want to throw regarding everything.
Okay, interesting. That's fair. I think that I would I put out a piece of perspective, I think, which is like a lot of people spend their time being angry and complaining about things. Sometimes these things go hand in hand. Sometimes these things are independent. I've rarely seen anything productive or good come out of either of these things. As in, I've rarely seen angry people do things that are useful, or seen much benefit in the emotion as a whole. Nor have I ever seen people who complain and make themselves a victim, find success in life. So my take on these things are, A, if you're angry, perhaps zoom out and consider what has caused you to act like a bitch. And B, if you're a victim, you should consider doing the same thing and figure out what is causing you to exhibit bitch-made behavior. But also, more importantly, if you come to someone with a problem, you should also try to come to them with a solution. I think that that's one of the most important things that I've tried to take away myself. In that, if I'm going to say, hey, like, this is fucked, I'll also try to say, at least if I have an idea of what I'm talking about, this is fucked, but what if we try this, or this, right? And that goes within teams, that goes in organizations, that just goes within life. So yeah, I think that's my biggest alpha. And then I think the last thing is like, it kind of goes hand in hand with all this stuff. It's just like, there is very little to be gained, again, from getting tilted or crashing out. I think I see this a lot in crypto as well, especially retentions run high. There's a ton of volatility, and people just every now and then straight up crash out and are just losing their minds. And I have a hard time with the behavior because I can't understand what would cause someone to do so if they're looking at improving their situation. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I
don't crash
completely
out is
agree.
kind of my go-to.
I completely agree. I try to look at things in like this lens too. This was a great alpha, different from what I usually get here, but was a great one. People who listen to this are probably going to improve their life in some way. Man, thank you very much for coming, man. Yeah, it was a great conversation. And where can we know more about you and about Berachain?
Yeah, man. On Berachain, I think, and myself, honestly, just Twitter is a good place to be. I'm on x.com/Smokey the Bera and x.com/Berachain. DMs are open, pretty accessible in most cases. So if someone's building something cool, if someone wants to learn more, just let me know.
All right, great, man. I'm going to leave the links in the description. Thank you again, Smokey. It was a great conversation, man.
Awesome. Thank you, man.